much for the introduction, Kate. Just to get started with an outline for the presentation, I started this research thinking about the intention, or what are the intentions behind cultural objects. How do we explore different cultural values that become embedded within objects? And what were the assumptions or expectations of the people who collected them? How might these objects end up in American collections? And how might those differ from what remains in communities? So I will explore these topics in 4 parts. First, I will go through an introduction of backstrap weaving as a practice, in case anyone is unfamiliar, and give some definitions on backstrap woven clothing. Then I will go over some of the symbolic meanings, especially in connection between the body and the environment within Mayan textiles. Then I will focus on how some of these objects ended up in MOIFA's collections and other collecting histories. And then I will talk a little bit about the virtual visits I conducted with with 2 weaving cooperatives who I have been working with in Mexico and Guatemala for a few years now. So something that I found my first week here that was very exciting was the exhibition Beyond Boundaries, which was presented at MOIFA from May 20th, 1984 to April 6th, 1986. And this is curated by Nora Fisher, a textile curator here. And this introduction from the exhibition, the themes of the Beyond Boundaries project express Maya resilience and cohesive, beyond the boundary of the Mexico-Guatemalan border, despite the boundaries imposed by rugged terrain, politics and religion, natural disasters of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, and even spanning boundaries of time. So I was very excited to find this essentially because Fisher's framework is similar to my own in that she was considering textile relationships or without thinking about this border as a result of colonial histories. So my field work that I did mostly in 2023 and 2024 focuses on 2 communities, one in Chiapas, Zinacantán, and one in Guatemala, which is Santiago Atitlán. Essentially, I spent 5 months in each region. Initially, I had wanted to work on intellectual property movements in both regions, as Guatemala has an emerging intellectual property law that's being driven by weavers, and Mexico has a law that went into place in November 2022. Let's move on to talking about how these textiles are made. So something that I really love about backstrap weaving, you can see a loom set up here. Essentially, the loom is attached to a pole or a tree, or sometimes even a hook drilled into the wall, and then is attached to the body. So the form of the body is already encoded into the cloth as the wearer makes it. This is very different from how we experience clothing as Westerners, where historically for woven clothing, we wanted it to fit precisely to the body, which resulted in tailoring. So clothing that focuses on weaving, the design is very minimal, there aren't very many cuts, and they remain in basic geometric shapes. The body in turn is also shaped by the textile process, as weavers also work on kneeling, and this training kind of starts from embodied actions within childhood of young Mayan children or of girls. So this video just shows a little bit of the weaving process, particularly in Zinacantán. So this is the process of winding the warp. Their warping board, I think, is quite unique because how they just think about it is wrapping it wherever they place this extra stick that's in the middle is how long the textile will be. And you have to be very precise in lining it up to make sure that you get a cross, which is how you count your threads in weaving. And this is the basic action of doing a plane weave once the fabric is actually onto the loom. That's passing of the weft. The vertical lines are called the warp. And basically what Pasquale is doing is separating the threads into halves so that the weft goes under and over. And you can see she's kneeling. Weavers will work like this for 2 to 4 hours maybe. From experience, I can tell you it is not very comfortable, but they're a lot more used to it. So in Santiago, something that is quite unique about the loom, or for Tzotzil speaking peoples, is that the name of the loom parts are equivalent to the parts of the body. The top of the loom directly translates to the head of the loom. The bottom directly translates to the butt of the loom. Whereas the cross, the part that organized the threads, is called the heart. The way they also warp the textile in Santiago Atitlán assures that there are 2 crosses. And as my weaving teacher told me, the textile is not finished until both crosses have been completed. Though that I think has been a case historically and isn't necessarily true, as weavers now do cut off the textile from the loom. And then the weft thread directly translates to the weaving tortilla, or the sustenance of the loom. So essentially, the textile is a living being that is getting fed and cared for by the weaver. There also is an idea that the motions of the body moving back and forth in that kneeling position mimics contractions. Or sometimes the way weavers say that their weaving is finished will kind of translate to my weaving came out, which is the same way you might talk about birthing a baby or the sun rising in the morning. And also, this is the Tzotzil warping board. The figure kind of has a human-like shape to it, and the top, where the circle is called the head, and the bottom is called the foot in Tzotzil. So if we think about the textiles as being living beings, what does that mean for the end of life for clothing? When I asked people about this, clothing discarding was not like how we experience it in the West. One of my interview participants said, when the clothing is completely worn out, I throw it away. My husband takes it to the mountainside, digs a hole under a tree, and turns them into an organic fertilizer. This was translated by a group of university students I was working with. So I think this act is kind of like an act of burial for the garment's life ending. At the end of a person's life as well, they will be buried with all of their clothing that remains. So, moving on to some other meanings embedded within the cloth. I use this idea of cuerpo territorio following a paper by Zaragoza and Carreta. They define cuerpo territorio as the inseparable ontological relationship between the body and the land. So what is experienced by the body is simultaneously experienced by the territory in a codependent relationship. Normally this is applied as a methodology and used to elicit historical changes with drawing what's happened to the land onto the body. But instead I use this as a concept to explain the corporeal manifestation of the land onto the body within clothing. So in Zinacantán, we don't have very many historical photos. The earliest that is easily available are thanks to Frank Cancian, who was one of the students involved with the Harvard Chiapas project. It was an extensive ethnographic project that started in the late 50s and I think expanded into the 90s. What they were able to do this after the construction of the Pan-American Highway. So essentially the countryside looked like this, with land kind of squared off. People lived in adobe houses with thatched roofs. and usually had a milpa, or a traditional corn field, behind their houses. Also dotted around the countryside, you could see women herding sheep. So this overshirt within MOIFA's collection would have been worn by a man, and is entirely made of wool. So it's a bit of a reflection materially of the environment. There's also still little bits of debris from the sheep roaming around in the area. However, Zinacantán has gone through, like every place, historic change. And beginning in the 1970s, they began planting flowers in order to sell to churches or other communities across Mexico. So as people began changing their milpa fields into flowers, there starts to be embroidery or geometric patterns of flowers blooming, so to speak, on the textiles. So this is an example of a man's vest, or pokul, from around 1980. I think it could be a little bit earlier, with just a little bit of the flower embroidery showing up. So as the floriculture industry has blossomed in Zinacantán, so have the designs on the textiles. So this example on the left is probably from around the 1980s. There's these small geometric flowers just at the bottom border, where, as you can see in the 2006 example, it's completely covered with flowers. Now they also use machine embroidery in order to really get those elaborate patterns on, but none of that is done with a computer. The machine is still completely controlled by hand, as well as the design and drawing of the flowers. This is a final photo of comparison from the year I was doing my field work, with a field of marigolds around the Day of the Dead that was in a family's compound that essentially was in the place where the milpa once would have been. And in Zinacantán, they also have a festival in which you need to change or show off your best outfits every year. So this is so you can directly pinpoint the year something came out. And this was the style of 2022. Within Santiago Atitlán, in Hills, the town is known as Siquin High, which means the house of the birds. This is a very famous bird of Guatemala, the quetzal, that on the left, that is still lives in the mountain areas surrounding Santiago, and I still think they're an endangered bird. And then on the left is a photo of a detail of a huipil with a tiny little quetzal in the brocade of the fabric. So these are some close-ups of a couple of huipils in MOIFA's collection. They also show a reflection, though in more simplified geometric figures, of animals in the surrounding area. So we can see a cat, two quetzales. The example on the right also includes an owl, perhaps a turkey or a peacock, a squirrel, and another cat. So again, the designs are directly coming from the environment. Finally, in the huipiles of Santiago Atitlán, particularly in the nimpot, or ceremonial huipils, the neck is a representation of the lake. So they usually add an extra piece of fabric for the yoke that represents Lake Atitlán. The three triangles that sit on the shoulders around the yoke are the three volcanoes that surround the lake, Atitlán, Toliman, and San Pedro. And then the embroidery around, during one of the virtual visit sessions, the members of the Weaving Cooperative Caholia describe this as being a rainbow, and these as being raindrops, though there is also some documentation in the archive from another anthropologist that said these were monkey nails. The cooperative members didn't feel like that was the case. They weren't sure where the anthropologists got that from. So just the importance of always checking back with the source community. And this is just an illustration of beautiful Lake Atitlán, in case you have never been there, as well as another detail of the volcanoes. So there has also been historical change within Santiago. While older huipils distinctly have this lake motif, newer huipils might not. I need to talk more with my community partners about why this might be the case. I kind of suspect it could be because of changes in systems of transportation. Whereas previously, I think that there was more movement around the lake just to get across town, for instance. Now people tend to drive a tuk-tuk to get across town and just walk between places that are close together. The designs have also changed to become more lifelike. This people credit with access to vintage photos that would be sold in the market, or old books that came down from North America, and people began copying bird designs from here. So often now you won't see local birds in huipils, but birds that might look North American or that were just coming from someone's imagination. There's also a bit of more complexity in the weave, whereas there was less brocade in older huipils. There began to be more brocade patterns added to the horizontal weft stripes. So, for some museum history now. Basically, so we know traditionally that Maya textiles are entombed with their owners or buried when they can no longer be of use. So collecting has never been has not been a common cultural practice within Maya communities until perhaps the last decade. And thus, anything that has survived historically is thanks to foreigners who gained interest in the region, or actually outsiders. And I use the term outsider specifically to also be inclusive of any Ladino collectors. Ladino is the Mayan term for people from Mexico or Guatemala who identify as more European than indigenous, even though they may have mixed blood. So ever since textile industrialization rose up at the end of the 18th century, there have always been a select group of people concerned with preserving the practice of making objects by hand. We see this, for example, in the arts and crafts movement in Britain with William Morris, who was looking back at handmade medieval textiles as the peak of British design. For the United States, this industrialization occurred around the same time that the country was being expanded territorially. So as the white settlers were moving west, people began to be concerned about preserving the material culture of the indigenous peoples. And in early anthropological history, we call this salvage anthropology, where essentially the anthropologists wanted to make sure everything was saved of a culture if there were no longer going to be people. And I think this idea for collecting objects has continued to influence collectors' motivations into the 20th century. And after the upheaval of World War I, intellectuals and art collectors became concerned about the growing increase of machinery in people's lives. This is what sparked inspiration for MOIFA's founder, Lawrence Bartlett, and I think marks the beginning of a collection of Maya textiles. In the 1930s, this was when the region became a little bit more accessible, mainly because of infrastructure being built thanks to coffee companies and things like the United Fruit Company. So the early 20th century is a point of departure for foreigners entering Guatemala, less so Chiapas. For Chiapas, more so just because it was so remote, there are not as many people who have visited, and really their collecting efforts begin more so in the 1970s. Also, folk art from both regions was being highly promoted. So in this interwar period, Mexico had just finished its civil war in 1920. That's in that same year, there was a big exhibition on Mexican folk art. It then traveled to New York City in 1921, and Guatemala began doing these World Fair-like things that especially had examples of the Indian pueblos, so to speak, where people could come witness a kind of clean, sterilized version of indigenous life. But this kind of sparked more interest from the north into Central America. So one collector who came in the 30s is Ruth Reeves, and mostly I cite this because there's this kind of incredibly devastating quote that she gave to the Tuscaloosa News after her trip in 1934. So she said, I paid $5 for a so Ruth, sorry, let me backtrack. Essentially, I think because of the cultural clash at the time of textiles, people were viewing or Maya people view the textiles as living beings. Americans, we see them as objects right now. So purchasing textiles at this time could be quite a difficult task. Designer Ruth Reeves went to Guatemala in 1934 with the support of a grant from the Carnegie Institute. She was tasked with collecting Guatemalan textiles for their collection, and then part of her proposal was to make her own new textile designs for interiors from what she had seen. So in the Tuscaloosa News, she says, I paid $5 for a foot Estival huipil, belonging to one woman. And although $5 is a great deal of money to a Guatemalan, their average pay is something like 10 cents a day, I thought that the gaunt, stern-faced old woman would snatch her huipil back from me when she saw me about to bear it away. It took 6 of her male relatives to restrain her from doing just that. So this is a very, I think, significant record to kind of show that cultural clash between having a living being taken away from you, or something that could be considered a living being, to simply purchasing a shirt. I think this could have been a common occurrence because in the MOIFA records there are often notes that I purchased this right off the back of an Indian. Just a reminder that collections, the way we get them isn't apolitical. But so some of our Maya collections begin with Florence Dibble Bartlett. Again, she's the founder of the Folk Art Museum, and part of her collecting began also because she believed that folk arts were disappearing and that these objects needed to be collected in order to be preserved. So she traveled to Guatemala first in 1935 and then again in 1946. It appears that she did not travel to Chiapas, mostly based on the fact that there are not any objects in our collection or much evidence of objects from Chiapas that she might have collected, at least textile-wise. And her first collection of textiles was honored with of Guatemalan textiles was honored with an exhibition in the Art Institute of Chicago. This exhibition happened a year after she returned and received great reviews from people who felt that the exhibition was colorful and surprising amidst other parts of the museum. So this example is a photo that would have been similar to the objects that were displayed at the Art Institute of Chicago. The mannequins were designed by René de Hocourt to be mahogany figurines that kind of mimic effigy figurines. So I think a very unique form to display the textiles. And what she ended up doing after her last trip to Guatemala in 1946 is that the Art Institute didn't want the objects, but what would become the Field Museum accepted them. So the majority of Bartlett's Guatemalan textiles are actually over there. But we do have a few of them. In a memorial to Bartlett after she had passed, Helen Parker, who was the education director at AIC, was very good friends with Bartlett, and she wrote a piece in order to honor Ms. Bartlett. And she talked about these Thursday lectures that Florence Bartlett sponsored at the Art Institute. They were free lectures at night that anyone could come to. And I think like once a month, Florence Bartlett gave her own lecture, usually based on her travels and her experiences abroad. And typically when she did this, according to Helen Parker, she would typically wear the traditional dress of whatever country she was talking about. And some of those textiles likely ended up in MOIFA's collection. And this, I think, is one of those. So according to our documentation here, this huipil was collected by Florence Dibble Bartlett, but then given or received by a Mrs. Willis Belang, who I could not find much information on. So if we trust our documentation, at one point this could have belonged to Ms. Bartlett. And during the virtual visit I had with my community partners, I noted to them that this V neckline seemed quite odd, because that's not a tradition. So they thought that it was likely put by an outsider, so either a Ladino person or a foreigner who had purchased the textile and adjusted it for their own wear. Whoever did this, either Ms. Bartlett or Mrs. Lane, I think this act shows the influence of collectors and how they'll begin to change textiles, and their views of textiles will begin to change the production of textiles for the future. Expansion of tourism kind of exploded in the 1970s. And according to an unpublished article I found in the collection that was very exciting, some communities decided to adapt their designs more to the taste of outsiders. Some decided to simplify their designs, so producing more objects over quality objects. And around this time that tourism was increasing was also when cooperatives began to be formed. These were formed either by anthropologists or often by Peace Corps volunteers to help with economic development. And in towns where the cooperatives were first founded is where weaving started to become more commercialized. So I think this is also marks kind of a decline in that perception of the textile as a living being. Excuse me. So these two objects are both from Zinacantán. The one on the left was purchased in 1983 by Nora Fisher on a trip she did for research for her Beyond Boundaries exhibition. Snaholovia was a cooperative founded by the anthropologist Walter Chip Morris, as well as an indigenous man, Pedro Mesa. He has come to IFOM multiple times, so some of you might be familiar with this cooperative. Part of their mission was to preserve textiles by creating art textiles that would mimic historical textiles and could go into museum collections. So this piece is quite unique because it has a historical basket weave pattern, but it's pretty much done in a combination of acrylic and cotton. The gray is a bit of a different design. So materially, it's trying to do a historical reflection and does not show what people would have been wearing likely in 1983, which would have been more so including acrylics and bright colors and just a little more crazy. I think also the textile is a reflection, even though they are working to make for a collector class or a museum class, the object is still simplified in a way that wasn't part necessarily of what was happening in fashion in the community at the time. And lastly, I just want to talk about the impact of the Civil War on textile production. So Guatemala has a 30-year civil war that lasted from the 60s into the 90s. And there's not much evidence of what happened to textiles. Also in this unpublished paper, there's some confirmation of things that had just been told that were actually written down in the era they were happening. So at this time, many people stopped wearing their traditional dress because of a fear of being perceived or recognized as Maya. The military was also trained to recognize which town the dress was from. So if someone from a certain type of dress was spotted from one town, was spotted in a different town, they tended to be targeted as assumed to be like guerrilla insurgents, essentially. Sometimes people also sold their heirloom textiles that they might have been saving for their burial in order to obtain necessities like food. Another aspect is Western aid organizations giving Western clothing because they had easy access to it. And when people left their homes, if they were seeking refuge, they often couldn't bring looms or proper yarn to create their own clothing. So to me, this is, I think, the historic start of the trade of used clothing within Guatemala. And often these pieces would be adapted into bags or similar things for outsiders' use. Many older Maya women don't like the idea of turning a huipil into a new object. Younger generations who don't have this association don't mind so much. Refugees also from Guatemala ended up coming into Chiapas, and this has also influenced design change there as people began to exchange techniques or see different designs from communities further afield. So, lastly, just some information that we learned from the virtual visits. So the cooperatives that ended up being able to come were Cojolia. They were founded by an American expat who was a designer and an Indigenous man in 1983. They talked about literally going to people's homes to knock on the door to see if they would participate during a precarious time when everyone was a little suspicious because of the Civil War. Now the majority of members are mostly women, although there are a few men who participate for certain expertise. I think about 6 members from Cojolia came to participate, but part of this was because people were moving in and out, or they'd go grab a person who had expertise in one type of item, or someone came in to drop off something at the cooperative and then saw the video visit happening and wanted to put in their ideas as well. For the textiles from Zinacantán, we had 3 participants from Mujeres Sembrando la Vida, which is a family-led cooperative. They began in 2001 as a microloan organization, but then transitioned into a weaving cooperative. And they are a cooperative of all women, as backstrap weaving is tended to be associated with women's work. So basically the results from these visits, both groups mentioned during their virtual visits that they rarely see historic objects that are as old as the ones in the MOIFA collection, because there are quite a few before 1950, and these probably didn't survive within their communities. As part of this exchange, they also, they were also amazed that these old pieces were being preserved. They both mentioned that, and part of this project, by the end, they noticed details and techniques that aren't as common anymore. So we will be sharing photos with each of the cooperatives for their own inspiration, teaching techniques, and passing on, and even perhaps reviving some techniques. And if I had all of the money in the world, I definitely would have flown people up here, but that's not the case. So I hope that one day there can be another similar exchange where people can come in person. So, just to conclude, through this talk, I hope that I have shared some mixed methods of community-based, object-based, and archival-based research. And through this kind of methodology, I was able to unravel a complex history of changes in perceptions, belief, and even the use and purpose of Maya textiles. I hope this presentation helped you all see the complexity of woven objects, and especially for these objects that have long been perceived as primitive, either in design or technology. I think even the backstrap loom is quite complicated. As well as thinking about different ways in which knowledge may be preserved. So thank you very much. I'd also just like to thank some of the MOIFA staff for their help in conducting my research, especially for the Summer Research Fellowship, with the support from EFAP and Susan and Stephen Goldstein. Also, thank you, Carrie Hertz, for all of your guidance, as well as Kyle Ullman, who's not here, but for his help in ruffling through the archives. Kate, thank you so much. Kate McCune, the Director of Collections, thank you for helping organize, looking at all of the objects, and for talking about how to properly catalog them. And then thank you to Kellen Hope, the Collections Assistant, Penny McBride, the Collections Manager, and Ben Brunt, the Collections Intern, for pulling objects and taking photos so that we could, or I could look at them very closely. That's all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions.